All right, so I wanted to make this live available just for another chance if someone wants to talk about some deep sources that they feel like we didn't get a chance to go over. As I'm always checking my list, make sure everything's straight. As you can see, I do allow links on my page. And also, I made sure I don't have anyone hidden right now. So all users, there's no one that's blocked at all on my page. So I had someone comment on an older video. Now, if you know how genetics go, as years go by, they find more information, things get more refined and everything. This one was about a year, 2 years ago, and I had someone come there just recently, just a couple of days ago, and he wanted to post some comments about M2, and he has some things to say because he feels like the common idea. He feels like J has to be the Israelites, and why? Just because of common agreement, not because any actual sources or anything like that. But I thought it was interesting how he tried to attempt to show this 23andMe find right here. So I'm going to show this. And I just want to point this out, when you think of who could be the Israelite lineages and whatnot, and there's a lot of conclusions and stuff, right? There's a lot of ideas on these different lines and whatnot. For example, this one, J1E, all right, they say arose about 10,000 years ago. Now, this is important because a lot of time with these J groups, everyone wants to assume that they only started in the Bronze Age or the Neolithic, but they don't want to look at their Paleolithic finds. So that's why on this page, when I had this individual come here and talk about that, I wanted to first give him sources before inviting him to come and have a conversation, as I want to have that conversation with anyone who wants to talk about these things or would like to have a conversation on these things. Beloved family. So right now is a weird time. I know I usually don't go live at this time, but I wanted to take this time because most of the people who usually want to talk about this stuff is people overseas. Like a lot of people in the Middle East, they like to look at the genetics and find out who's Israelites and stuff like that, right? I never put this as a salvation-based issue, but I do put this as an interesting academic study, right? To find who could be the Israelites, right? Don't take any offense if someone feels like they're a G group and they feel like they're Israelites, or if they're an R group and they feel like they're Israelites. I met them all. I met R groups who feel like they're Israelites. I met E groups who feel like they're Israelites. I met I groups who feel like they're Israelites. I met T groups who feel like they're Israelites. I met J groups who feel like they're Israelites. I met all those groups that feel like they're Israelites. Now, if we're taking it as a tribal confederation, they all could be Israelites, but there's only one bloodline of Abraham that we can assume or conclude as a bloodline of Abraham. That's the biggest thing about it. But I let everyone, present their case as these are one of the biggest things that we can find is the evidence. But one of the biggest things I always notice about J is that the roots are always ignored, right? The J group doesn't actually start 10,000 years ago. It starts like Paleolithic 20,000 years ago, further back. And that's a lot of things that a lot of people don't know about when they think about the connection of those J groups and whatnot, and how they actually are tied together. Like, for example, just some of their interesting finds are these ones, the Mesolithic finds of J, and these certain finds right here. And these ones are interesting because these ones are the conclusion of the 10,000 years ago connection, Mesolithic. But J's location is upper corners of Finland and Russia by its actual ancient finds. That's actually what we would see technically. And usually that's ignored. I don't know why they're ignored. You think that someone want to go about it, logically with sources and everything. But we did find some J groups over there. I have a paper with all the J fossils, so I know this one would be found in Russia and whatnot. So it makes perfect sense for a lot of these finds. And there was also another one of that one, that was found also in Mesolithic Russia, J groups. So it's like, when you think about it, they would be ancient Paleolithic, how you say, or Mesolithic Europeans. They'll be linked to Paleolithic Europeans and Mesolithic Europeans. That's one of the biggest things about it. This one, I'll just open it up on my thing because sometimes these finds are hard to find. I just want to see how hard that would be to find. But so that's pretty much what I'm doing today. So I wanted to have that conversation with this individual in particular, or any individual that wanted that time to have this conversation. Because, you know, these things are really interesting when you think about it. It's just some people, what's the word I'm looking for? They get upset when they see the sources. They don't like the sources, right? So I want to get upset when they see the sources. They don't like. All right. All right. So that link is in the description. If that brother comes by, we'll have that conversation. If not, this is just a live available that we are willing to have these type of conversations on these type of matters, because they're kind of important and deep, I think. So I'm gonna let him, you know, present his case. You know, why would he think this ancient European group would be the Israelites? What will be the reason, right? What's the reason behind that thought, right? Because that's pretty much a thought. But here I'll pull up all right, because I haven't went on the J groups in a minute. You know, most people who are now going into the ancient finds, they know that it would link to the Caucasus culture, that the Caucasus invasion would be accountable for the J groups movements. And that would mean that J would have early ties with Indo-Europeans, because they would have ties to Hurrians. And that's what we had found earlier. But let me open up a note here, because there are some finds of J that are constantly ignored. I think when they're realized, it brings the whole picture together, right? Because when you think, who are the Phoenicians and the Levant, and who would be in the Levant in certain groups that would be in certain areas of Levant, and you'll start to realize something, that history tells the story that there was an Indo-European invasion in the land. We have to account for that historically, right? So I'm just going to open this little thing up real fast. So if he comes by, we're going to talk about some things and make something clear, just for the sake of understanding. All right. Amen. That's right. Amen. That's all love. That's right. Shout out to the J brothers. Amen. All love. So let's take a look at what we actually see here. So what we're going to look at is the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic. So what we're going to do first, before we even get any of the Bronze Age, any of the Middle Ages, any of the Iron Ages, or any of the other ages, we need to point out what are the roots of this line, right? We get down the roots, we can understand what's going to happen in the Neolithic movements. So the Neolithic movement is going to have some important movements. So first, let's point out what we see here on the J node. So what's the most important thing we need to understand? That we will get this line mostly settling in these upper areas. Why? Because IJ, right? The node IJ, we're one, right? So we can pull up also fossils and finds of IJ in the areas of Europe, which will be about in this area. But first, we have to note here, here's the ones that we're just talking about. So you can see that's that find. And this is going to be for those who look into these things, or this brother directly, if he's curious about why this line is actually ancient European. So you can see what we have there. So in Russia, and we can see this one as well. So both of these will be on this find right here. So you'll see this one right here. That'll be one. And we have one right here. So we have this one and this one. And it tells you to study, and it tells you to find, it tells you the age. That's one of the biggest things. So J is older than Abraham. You know, some people, you know, they use that concept of one line being older than Abraham. So 1 point, that's going to be older. So any line that we look at, technically to their ancient finds, they're going to be older than Abraham. So that's just going to, I'm just going to throw that out there, because why am I saying that? Because this individual, what did he say? He said something really interesting that I thought was kind of interesting, because he was kind of stressing how old this line was and whatnot. And he said something wrong, but I'm going to point out. So he said EM2 is 17,000 years ago. Now, he uses family tree, which uses SNPs to assume the age. Now, it's not 17,000 years ago. Family tree says it's 15,000 years ago. So right here, 15,000 years ago, that's quite clear. But that's not even a fossil culture. So that's important to know. right? It just tells us the time frame they expect the SNP to pop up. So that's very young too. M2 is younger than the Natufians. So the Natufians, they're Paleolithic, Mesolithic groups. So this group would have popped up somewhere after the Neolithic, because we actually don't have any Mesolithic finds of it, just to make that clear. Well, we do have Neolithic finds of it. But we got to also note that it would have had popped up when this line, so we can point the earlier one right here. You can see this is already in the lands of the Caucasus Mountain. So if we're getting the idea that this one about maybe 15, 13,000 years ago, right, before present, that's about 15 BC. And it's like J groups started in the Caucasus Mountain and kind of diverse out into the areas of the north. See, here's another one. This one just was found 2022. So that's clearly making a large J group. So they're obviously going to be European. So that's easy to see. And that would tell us what happens in the Neolithic divisions. So now we can get an idea how they start to settle in the areas of Europe, and then they start to spread out. So we're first noting that this line had went all the way into the areas of Russia, Finland, right? And then they kind of spread out into different areas. So that's important. So now they're starting to go down into these areas, right? That's very important to know where it actually is located, so we can bring it to a real culture, right? Put the totality of the whole culture in your face so that you can assume the right conclusions, right? If it is an Indo-European line, is it connected with Indo-Europeans, right? From the Caucasus to Finland to upper northern areas, we would get some of those lines becoming Europeans, right? Even if they were starting to go down into areas with the Hittites and everything. Even the Kassites come down here in these areas, right? We know these things. These are things that make sense, right? This would probably be more of a line that would be early lines of the IJK divisions that would be more Indo-European, right? So that's something that we have to know. So even just the assumption of saying, well, this one is 15,000 years ago, but what fossil find is 15,000 years ago, because what I'm showing you here are actual real cultures. So that's the difference between assumptions and actually laying down a fact, like an actual culture fact. Now, that obviously that's not the only thing, but we need to understand the total picture of these groups. But it's all about what is the real picture of these groups. Now, by showing this right here, this just shows us that, one, he doesn't really have a great source to really show for this line, because what he actually tries to do is basically use someone's modern genetic haplogroup test, and basically he's presenting it as if it was something that was connected to an ancient line. For example, I'm gonna show real fast one of the lines that he kind of throws out here. So he not only says M2 is 17,000 years ago, which is wrong based on his own source. He also basically, before that, he had shared something that was kind of interesting, and he asked me a question. He said, what age do I think basically E1B1A is? Because I'm not a name Nazi. If he made a mistake on the spelling, I'm not going to blame him for that. But he said, how old was E1B1A? Well, obviously we have different papers that tell us it's about Neolithic time frame, but I wanted him, to basically give him what he wanted. So he shared this. So I'm going to show what this is. Obviously, let me point out what's the main point to know about this. This is family tree, and it's using ancient connections. Now, on family tree, it will have sources for the ancient connections. And that's important because it will start to tell you how people are tied. But notice the oldest link to any E1B1A group is an attempt of Mota. Why is this important? Because we already factually proven Mota has a back migration. How do we prove that? With a couple different sources. But I already laid them down on this little thing, so I'm gonna just read it real fast, because when he shared that, I thought it was interesting because it was Mota, right? It was Mota. If you know how Mota is, I already told him earlier, so let me just go up and point this out if I could. All right, so right here. So we already had talked to a professional on this line, the Mota line and everything, but we also had actual sources telling us that the E1B1 groups aren't Neolithic. They're not, the E1B1 groups that make the M2 groups are not Neolithic in Africa. So none of the sample individuals from Shumlaka or Africa, West Africa, are closely related to most present-day Bantu speakers. So Bantus today, groups that are in Bantu today, weren't there in the Neolithic. They're not ancient, right? They don't stay there that long. They weren't there that long, right? So it just lets us know, obviously, they were replaced and everything. Right, that was a study we had talked about before already. But also we know that the Bantu groups, at least 2,000 years ago, and all the Iron Age Bantu groups, E1B1A, none of them go past into the Bronze Age. That's important. They're actually, as it says, 2,000 years ago, right here, we estimate that the African admixture in the Middle East occurred within the last 2,000 years, right? And what did it tell you it was from the Bantu speakers from Kenya and whatnot. So that's important. Besides the fact that we had got a answer from Peter Revesz, right? He's a professional, right? He looks at the genetics and stuff, right? And he told us that Mota directly about Mota, when I wrote him about Mota, right? 2022, he said that you're right. That is not truly African. Why? Because he did work on the Minoans. And he actually confirmed Mota had a link to the Minoans. So Mota had an automatic Eurasian back migration. But this individual thought it was wise to try to show me the Mota and try to say, oh, he has a shared ancestor 37,000 years ago. This is the assumption. Okay, if he has a shared ancestor 37,000 years ago, how do we know if that person was in Africa or in Europe? Do we have that fossil find? Do we have that culture? No. That's actually what we actually have to note on this little thing, is that this assumption to Mota and claiming that he's even Neolithic, but Mota is actually Bronze Age. This age right here is actually Bronze Age. They sometimes like to push those said titles back, those Neolithic, because Neolithic, Bronze Age, Iron Age differs in different lands. So that's something important. But you can see right here, this person is assuming that this person obviously, and note the fork here. Note the fork here. So Mota obviously is saying it was related to this person. Now, this person has to be E1B1C, not M2, because Mota is actually under E1B1C or E-M329. So that's another thing that's important about Mota. It's just that they share a similar mtDNA, not the same mtDNA, but a similar. But Mota himself, the male of it, right? If we're saying that is that B38 line is going to be making E1B1C, but also it has a Eurasian back migration. So by using this source, he shows that he doesn't even have a culture here. That's not a culture. In fact, this is talking directly about Mota. And just by the connections of saying, what he might be connected to, that just shows that, honestly, we have to look at sources in their totality, right? I'm saying basically looking at the whole thing and actually confirming a culture, right? For example, let's take an interesting stroll on what we already confirmed about Mota and what the culture finds show us. Right, just gonna point out something real fast. Now, Mota is about they say he's pushing 2000 BC ish, right? And Mota also connects to some real Neolithic finds in Eurasia, because as we had seen before, right, we had seen other writings of this, that Mota also has ties to the Ari, and we had seen using genetic evidence from Eurasia, ancient genomics and ancient genomes and present day populations, the researchers determined that the migrant ancestors of the Ari were closely related to early farmers who moved into Europe from the Near East 9,000 years ago. So 9,000 years ago, just like how we was pointing out before with the 7,000 BC E1 groups, blows all that out of the water, blows anything that you're trying to connect anywhere near Mota as an African group out of the water. So the years that are assumed here, this is not a culture when it says a shared ancestor. Okay, so who is the shared ancestor? Can I click on any of these and find that shared ancestor? No, it changes information. So it just tells me that he has a shared ancestor. How do they know that they have a shared ancestor there? Do we have that ancestor? One, do we have that source for that ancestor? Do we have an academic paper with a ancestor found in Africa or anywhere else? Because this actually says a shared ancestor, doesn't tell you where. This doesn't tell you where the ancestor is. So it's an assumption to say that it's in Africa. It's an assumption, right? You can't assume a source, right? I don't know how everyone be putting faith in these sources like that, but if you got a real academic scientific source, you got to display it, maybe ask some questions about it and verify it. I don't think that this is actually, obviously, this is not a culture, right? That claim right there is not telling us the year. So that's why I thought it was interesting that he said, or he decided to use that. It just kind of shows a desperation. It shows that he's probably not looking at these ancient cultures really pinpointly. But he did say, I did like that he did try to use that and point out, oh, that line was African up to such and such years ago and all that. So you can see this is a classic saying, right? They say it's super old, so it's impossible for it to be Abrahamic religion or Abraham line. So that is just silly, right? I just want to show you that that's silly. It's silly to conclude because a line is old in Europe or Africa that it can't be Israelites. We have to look at the total picture of it, the total picture. Because if we're saying that just because it's old, it can't be Abrahamic, well, what's interesting is once you study genetics very carefully, you start to realize something. M2 is one of the youngest nodes. So if M2 can't be Abraham, what makes any other node able to be Abraham when almost every single node started in the Neolithic? That's why we got the Neolithic bottleneck. So a lot of nodes start in the Neolithic. Even if we take their ancestral node, they go further back. Like J goes all the way back to Mesolithic, Paleolithic. EM2 starts around the Neolithic by the fossils. Yeah. So I'm just taking the time, at an interesting time to have this conversation and to display these arguments so that it can be known that I'm not putting these things aside. I'm not blocking anyone. I'm not stopping anyone from having a conversation. I'm not stopping links. I'm not stopping sources. We're looking at all those things. We're talking to professionals. We're getting scholars on this thing, and we're verifying it, right? We're going to verify it. So when it actually comes down to it, just saying J is the Jews and not really showing any academic resolve to bring that tie together just makes you want to look into J a little more closer. And surprise, surprise, we found J as ancient Turks or ancient groups in Mongolia or groups that would settle in the areas where you actually have lines that would become like the Kassites or like the Hurrians, Caucasus Mountains, or Indo-European nodes before any of the Semitic groups. In fact, most geneticists don't even claim J as Semitic. J is not even a Semitic node until it started picking it up with the lingua franca later in the Bronze Age when the Akkadians took over. But that's what from the E groups that were down there with the T groups moving around. So J came in a little later, and T and E was already in the Levant. T, E, H, R, these were in the Levant before J. Those were be in the Levant before J was in the Levant. So J was moving throughout the upper European area for a long time, and then it became Indo-Iranian from Indo-European and some Indo-European groups. Until some groups, like I said, you got to know this though, the Levant had a lingua franca. So just because someone spoke Semitic in the Levant doesn't mean they started Semitic. That's important. So Bronze Age Semitic groups aren't the origin of Semitic groups. That's important to know. So just because a J group becomes Bronze Age Semitic doesn't mean that they began Semitic. So that's important to consider on how those Semites are all put together. Now, can they had mixed in with the Israelites? Yeah. Could T had mixed in? Yeah. Could R, could E, could any group have mixed in? Yeah. But we got to look at the sources to bring that together. The reason why we know this line E1B1A is directly Israelites is because we found them in ancient Israelites. So we got to look at the ancient ones and we'll verify the lines. But notice ancient Israelites are rare. So that you got to consider that. So that's one of the biggest things. So making assumptions based on years is baseless. is groundless. And a lot of these lines that are concluded as being Arabic and stuff, he's missing the total picture of what happens in the Neolithic, on how these groups, they don't start in the areas of the Levant, nor are they mainly Levantan, but they're mainly basically Indo-European and basically Caucasoid. And that's just an honest thing to know. So that means if we have Hurrians moving down into the Levant, which we do throughout the Bronze Age, and we have the Caucasus invasions, which we do, it would make perfect sense for looking at those groups. And there's a lot of brothers who did a lot of studies directly on like the Caucasus invasions or the Hurrian invasions, and you'll get a good understanding that there's no doubt that J had to move from the north. It had to move from the north. It had to first start as basically a route to Proto-Indo-European groups. That's one of the biggest things to know. But E groups, we know that, of course, they were Afro-Asiatic, but we got to be careful on like which node this E1B1 came from, because we know sources tell us they were clearly Semitic. That's one of the biggest things that we already know, that sources tell us they were Semitic. So we can't leave that fact that they were Semitic. So you can see just from looking at this, we're looking at a snip assumptions, and none of these are actual like cultures by name. So taking Mota and then trying to link it to this and saying, well, there must be also a 37,000-year-old find, but not actually having that 37-year-old find, but only having Mota, just shows that there's some lack of direct understanding of the information being displayed. So just in all honesty, that we had to look at the total information if we want to really make that conclusion, right? But from what we found, especially from even just this source alone, unless there is a providing source to this, right? Maybe a academic paper or something peer reviewed or something more than this. This is not going to tell us where this culture is. If it's a shared ancestor, if they have a shared ancestor, is that shared ancestor E1B1? Is that shared ancestor CT? What is the shared ancestor? Is it saying that it's of V38? And if so, why do we find V38 in the Neolithic in France? So that's one of the biggest things to talk about, that this would tie, just like we were talking about before, the RE groups in the areas of Europe and that left from the Near East. So that would make it basically Eurasian. So that's one of the biggest things too, is that a lot of people will say, oh, it came from Africa, so it can only be African. But based on the out of Africa concept, isn't everyone African? So it's like, if we could debunk the out of Africa concept, then we got obviously a point there. But besides doing that, the concept of that this line came from Africa, and saying that, oh, since it came from Africa, it can't be African. I mean, it can't be Israelites. It can be African. Defeats the understanding on how we are all supposedly African. So that's one of the biggest things to understand, is that using the fact that they're African is weaker than using the fact that a line is from Europe or from America, right? It'd be less likely for a line in Europe or America to be Abraham than an African to be Abraham. Why? Because there were monotheistic groups in Africa prior to Abraham. So monotheism was something that was very linked to like areas of Egypt. So we could have had that line or that family around that area, because Abraham was around that area and others were around that area. But also the Semitic languages would have started off around, as we can get an idea of like maybe like let's say like the cradle of civilization, right? Let's think about the cradle of civilization, right? We can see that the cradle of Semitic will be right here in the Levant, right? And it when it went down into Africa, into other places. But if you notice a lot of designs at the Zagros Mountains, not a lot of these Semitic groups crossed the Zagros Mountains. So that's one of the biggest things that we noticed. But we noticed that what makes sense, these Hurrian, Eritrean, many groups, right? Many and all that, Kassites, the Caucasus languages, and the Hittites. And notice what this looks like right here. Doesn't this Neolithic map kind of like tell you something if you when you kind of look at it, right? See this one, right? You think about the Neolithic farmers and stuff, and these little areas, the Hittites, the Caucasus tribes, the Hurrians, the Kassites, and whatnot. A lot of Elam was replaced by Indo-European groups too. Basically, the Medes were over there, right? They were also very large. But you know what we actually find when you look at that? It looks like the understanding of what we see with J, because we actually would start to see that this line would settle in a lot of different areas. Like, let's just look at the Bronze Age. Look at how they go into a lot of these different areas here. One would say, oh, well, see, now they're into the Semitic areas and whatnot, right? But what would be their ties? What would be their connections? What would be who they were linked to, right? Who would these groups be linked to? And how would they pick up that Semitic group? By moving down into the area where Semitic was being spread. But notice what's interesting about this group is that the more you look at them, the more they don't fit what's described as a Jotunite. Because Jotunites, by history, describe going down into areas of Yemen. And we don't even got J going down into Yemen. And we don't got them going down to Punt. So it's interesting because J starts way too high up to be most of the Semitic groups. That's what's very important, is that they're not moving the Semitic language. That's what's important about this line. They're moving a lingua franca that everyone else starts to have already. That's all that they pick up is a lingua franca. This is not shocking because if you think of the basically a lot of the Phoenicians and all those different groups, let's kind of get a good understanding of what I'm saying here, is that a lot of the Indo-European groups came down, right? If you already studied on like how you say the Levantan Phoenicians, they weren't Hamites anymore by the Bronze Age. They weren't. Here you go upstairs. Season. But what were they? What were they? They were basically a line that replaced them from the Caucasus Zagros Mountains. So you can see right here, this from a real study that we knew that the groups in this area, the Zagros and the Caucasus Mountain groups, replaced groups in the Levant. They started to replace groups. And that's why we get the Phoenicians, right? The early seafarers and whatnot. We think about the real Canaanites during the Bronze Age. That would be kind of important to note where they came from, some areas that they actually would have came from and settled in these areas. We went very deep into that to explain why Sidon, BA, is important and why a lot of these groups are important. Look at that. Sidon is a Canaanite, right? And that's before the Israelite. Look at that. That's before Abraham, right? So that's what we see right there. J is not Abraham. J is before Abraham if we want to take that approach, right? Technically, J would be before Abraham because he would be seen as a Canaanite. And what did it say in the scriptures? It said that Abraham was up on these areas somewhere, but some reason we got J's already down there. So if we're taking that approach and then go to his roots, it had to be Indo-European, and it matches for what we see for the movements of the Phoenicians, who were originally, as we see, Indo-European. So if we take that large number scale like that and say, well, based on these hypothetical numbers, and this one is showing us fossils, but M2 don't have no actual fossils of lines this old, only assumptions. But we actually got fossils of other lines this old, right? We can do this with T, we can do this with G, we can do this with H, bring out the actual fossils to show you the actual movements. But this J group is one of the ones that are assumed to be Jews or assumed to start in Arabia or in the areas where they would have Semitic movements, but they don't. That's one of the biggest things. The total picture shows us that this line has to be either Caucasus, Caucasus, Hurrian, basically an invasion from the north that had to be basically developing in these areas and then go down into the areas. So that's something to know. A and B groups would have started over here, but E groups would have started around these areas and would have spread out. They would have been more that middle culture group, right? So for that, just for that total understanding of that picture and whatnot. This is what I'm showing you, is that this is what this brother showed. I didn't want to, I'm not hiding his information. He just commented on an older video, but I want to show that this is something that I'm up for. If someone wants to talk about these genetic lines and the real finds and whatnot, and talk about what we have there of these lines, we can talk about that and point out what they have. Because a lot of times the first thing people want to talk about is E1B1A is in the Bantu, but don't want to actually check the academic papers of the Bantu and find out maybe the Bantu had older haplogroups that are not E1B1A. So maybe they did have E group, but which E groups did they have? Did they have E1B1B first that came from the Tufians, or from the Iberasians or Iberusians from Spain? Did they come from those groups first? Because the E1B1A groups are not first in the Bantu. They don't start off the Bantu culture. A lot of people don't know that. The Igbo, the Bantu cultures, they're not started off by E1B1A. You know, because if you look at the academic papers, they'll tell you, they'll show you what actually started there, right? And we got those papers too. We got those papers that talk about those things as well, just to go into those things. So I just want to give that opportunity for this. So I don't know if this brother going to come live or have this conversation. A lot of these individuals, they like to shoot and run, right? They like to throw some sources out and run and say, oh, I know all these things. Shoot them out and run. And when you say, oh, let's have a conversation on them, let's talk about that source, they don't want to talk about the source. Or they want to say like, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. You don't have no clue. All right. I keep telling people that I had a private study with a geneticist. I'm telling you guys that if you want to look at the information and look at the roots of these stuff, right? If you already had studies in biology, how am I getting tongue twisted? Biology. If you already had studies in biology and different things like that, you got a stepping idea. Like you think of the nodes, the fork, the way that these clades work and certain things like that. It's not too different. But once you put it on the table, Y chromosome, human Y chromosomes, and you look at how they're monophylactically connected, and then you look at their fossils, it'll give you something clear. But I just thought it was hilarious that he was kind of shooting. He was just shooting sources, and he kept on putting a repeat. And I wanted to give him the chance to realize that those were blanks. All you're shooting is blanks. It's not something that is actually I'm gonna look at and be like, oh man, that's a source I gotta look at and put that into action onto this line. But he didn't share anything that is different. It's just these hypotheticals, right? He even said what's interesting about it is that what's weird is that these individuals, certain individuals like this, who don't believe the biblical narrative, don't believe Shem, don't believe him, would say what's a Israelite or a Jew. Because this individual basically has said he don't believe basically Ham, Shem, and Japheth exist by nodes and all that stuff. But he want to tell you what's a Jew from Abraham. But that's what he says. Now, as for Isaac, he is blah, 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 blah. So how do we know that Isaac is that? Because we don't have Isaac, right? So we don't want to make any assumptions like that, but we want to look at these nodes and prove the nodes. That just saying it is not proving the node. So that's not proving anything. But it says, and it just talks about different lines of the said high priest, Jewish lineage, whatnot. He just says that they are this mutation, whatnot. Nothing proves it, right? He just puts all this different things, right? That's all he says. And this is a classic thing. J-267, they say is the high priest line. But more geneticists had looked into it and started to connect it to Turks, ancient Turkish lines from Mongolia, because a lot of groups that go down get destroyed. Though we find their fossils of ancient time, a lot of them get destroyed, but most of them that survive will be in Mongolia, in Turkestan, in Turkish areas, right? We know because we got actual finds of them, right? We got real finds of them, right? And just show it right here. Look at these are the groups that survived. You see these groups right here? This one is a P58. So you can see these SNPs. Most likely all these SNPs that he's talking about on here, all these little SNPs, I probably can find them myself, I probably can find all these snips and point out what's the problem with a lot of these things. But these groups right here that would have been in these far areas over here, as you can see, this is like obviously older than Abraham, right? 3000 to 2000 BC, right? And this one as well, older and further out than the Israelite Exodus. So it's like, what's going on over there? This area over here would be some J groups that would be basically groups that become some of the Turkish groups later on. And we had talked about this before because this is going to be SLC 45A2 if this is it, yeah, or UUS 001. That's what that rather is. Let's just get that more correct. That's UUS 001. And I did a massive study on UUS 001 and how that became the Turks, how that group officially became the Turkish groups. But I'll just leave it like that. So if it's based on older ages, right? If it's based on older ages, they make themselves a hypocrite. If they say, oh, it's too old to be Abraham, well, you're a hypocrite. Because wouldn't your line or any other line be also too old to be Abraham, right? So we got to look at it at its total nodes, right? We got to look at them at their total nodes, not just saying, oh, I found some in Arabia, so those ones must be the ones. But rather looking at, oh, wait, let's look to see if J would root before these said Abrahamic lines, would they root to like maybe some other like lines, maybe like indo-European, because J does come from IJK. So IJ makes I groups, which are surely indo-European, and J groups, which they claim has Levantan cultures. Well, it all adds up when you take IJK, make those divide into their family. So IJK, who is that? Who is IJK, right? On the family tree. Who would IJK be based on the biblical narrative? It has to be either Ham, Shem, or Japheth, because that's how a monophylactic family works. A lot of people, they will skip that understanding. What's a monophylactic family, right? What's a monophylactic family? Why does it matter? Because a monophylactic family is a clade. It counts the same thing as a clade. That means that, let me just do a paint tool. That means that if you ever see anything like this, just paint it on here. Let that open up real fast. All right. Let's just paint it real fast because I want to show you real fast why you want to pay attention to these type of things. Whether you know genetics or not, this is something that's important to know. Monophylactic family or a clade or a node. So I'm just going to draw a simple one. So this will be a root. The root will count from where you start. If you don't have a stem that stems off like that, or if it stems off like this, like everything like has no root at the center, like this, and you have letters on the end right here, like you have, let's say you have letters here or something, like we're not. Let's say you got letters there. We're not. So let's say you got letters at the end right here, like that, right? That would be an unrooted chart. But if you got a chart like this, and you got letters on the end like this, let's say you got letters right here. That's right.
Yeah.
And right here. All right, so let's say you got letters like that. If you got letters like this, where would your nodes be? Right here. So that's a simple. This is actually a simple tree. This will be your node. Okay, you want to go upstairs? You got stuff all on your face. Go wipe your face. You got stuff on his face. All right. So this will be your node right here. This little area. Now, why is that important? Let me just clear up that thing on the side right there. All right. So this will be basically a simple chart for understanding a tree. And I'm probably gonna do a live separate on what's the difference between these trees, because these things are also important to note too. So let's just say on this side, you know, you got one letter. I'll just put circles.
One circles. What is she doing?
Here, go get a napkin. All right, so node there. This will be a family here, and this is the node. Now, the reason why I want you to understand this design right here is because let's say we're looking for Abraham. What we have to find is a family of Shemites, because it says Abraham is a Hebrew. So if we can find Hebrews, that would be even better. But if we can find the Shemites, that would bring us to that family. So let's say this will be Abraham. What other families would come from Abraham, right? Some other different type of families, whatnot. But we got to link it from our faxad. That means we can't have an Abraham unless we consider our faxad. So our faxad, Elam, all that. So that's one of the biggest things to understand, right? Hold on. Let's go upstairs. All right. So that's what we need to understand. So most people that are pointing to Abraham, they're pointing at one node. Like they're saying this node right here is making, let's say they say like a J group. Let's say this node is making a J group. Okay, you go upstairs. So that's what they're concluding. They're concluding one node is making a J group. Now, if this is making a J group, guess what that would mean? That means that this line has to be rooted to an ancient node. So let's say we keep rooting it. It's gonna bring it to an I and J group, right? Let's see, star. Let's put star right here. So no matter what J they choose, it's gonna be under J star. And no matter what they choose, they have to realize that this node counts with this. What does that mean? That means we have to find out where this node would be, right? And I can prove that this node would obviously be 20,000 years ago, clearly Paleolithic in Europe. So it's going to blow that concept out of water. Besides connecting to IJK, which is a deeper node, that means there's nodes of nodes. So when you see a family like this, know that you're not just counting for J. You got to count for every single node from early humans. So that means from the beginning of till J, you got to account for where it goes. So you got to tell us where F goes, HIJK, IJK, IJ, and then J. Because that's really how old J is. J doesn't just pop up in the Bronze Age from nowhere. You got to account for his father. But all love, because this is just something that I want you to understand, that when someone chooses these nodes, they don't really know what challenge they're actually putting themselves against. And that's why what makes the E1B1A groups like that interesting is because they're working on assumed information, right? If someone said, oh, this information, this is like one of the oldest V38 lines, but it's not M2. It's not M2, but it's V38. But we also confirmed this one to have a back migration to Africa, because there's no older one than this. That's what makes these M2 family lines interesting. So V38's brethren, what it would more look like. Let's say we was to design it for the M2 family, right? They obviously would link to how you say D&E groups, right? Okay, you can sit down. And let's illustrate this one as well. So right here, you have your node. So that would be obviously your node that ties all these together. So let's say this one would be basically E1, B1, E2. That's what this would be. And it would make E1, B1A, right? And let's say this is E1, B1A star, right? And it will also separate from E1, B1B star. Now, obviously, this is when I'm showing this, I'm showing it in the simplest way of showing these monophylactic families. Obviously, there could be more branches from this. In fact, there's another one from here, which is actually will be right here. And what will be there would actually be E1B1C. So E1B1C actually would be also a node from these groups. So that now with that understood and understanding, this would link to, like, as you go up nodes, right? This has to be, all these are YAP groups, YAP plus groups. This is YAP negative. So A and B is YAP negative. All the CF groups are YAP negative, but D and E is YAP plus. That may not seem like important, but it actually is very important and highly ignored, and is very important. So obviously this will go all the way to E-M96 to DE. But if we can start taking, now this is the one, this one right here is Mota. This one's Mota. That one's confirmed with a Eurasian back migration. So we confirmed in the family of this line that it has a Eurasian back migration. And Mota is older than any E1B1A other groups found in Africa. So this one actually would be like after you get your basically V38 divisions, you'll basically have a lot of those M2 lines settling Bronze Age, Iron Age in Africa. Not Neolithic and not Mesolithic and not Paleolithic. That's what's important to know about it, because it's going to come from that Natufian P2. So it has to exist after the Natufian P2. So that means that where would Natufian start off at? Is that the cradle of the Semitic language? That based upon some of the sources, yes, that will be basically the cradle of the Semitic nations. So we can get Central Semitic, West Semitic, East Semitic, all those Semitic groups that rise up to different nations would have started off in this area. And also it would make sense for the movements of the South Semitic into Africa. So that's something that's important to know about these lines, is that these lower lines here would be more likely to be early Semitic groups than these upper Caucasian groups. Now, just to get it understood when I'm saying that, it's important to know that when you're taking the biblical narrative and you're trying to make it literal, first you're going to get some disbelief. Like, how can you make the Bible literal? But I guarantee you, almost any person who believes that Jesus came to earth believes that he mixed with the Israelites. So they must be a bloodline. They must be a real people that existed. Abraham must be a person that existed and had his own family. Or are we saying that he's just someone with this crazy node that was just like everyone had his node, right? That's one assumption, but I'm not going with that assumption. We're going off like basically academically. If he's an individual that raised in the Bronze Age, he would be a separate family after the Neolithic bottleneck. So he has to be separate. He's going to be a separate family. That doesn't mean that if someone's not that line, they can't be saved or won't find any like thing precious to know about Abraham of the biblical narrative. It just means this is like a hobby. This is a different concept of what we're doing here. We're taking academic information, the most professional of opinions, not just, there's a lot of people with their own thoughts, not thoughts, but actual sources and looking at them. And that will bring us to the understanding of this, of the real picture of what we're seeing here, is that most of the nations that started as a Hurrian, Caucasus Mountain, all that, they're just going to be, rooted to Indo-European. And we got to account for that. So that's going to be very important, I would definitely say. But let's see, you have some M2. That one can be debated if M2 had Semitic origins. Necessarily, I would say yes, because the Natufian, this is why I would say that it has Semitic origins, because Natufians. And we know M2 has ties to Natufians, right? So like, for example, let's go to one of the studies we did and point it out. But that's a great statement. You gotta give your honest opinion that you believe M2 wouldn't be Semitic by origin. And it would almost seem like that. But once we realized something really interesting. Not only did we link M2 by its Neolithic finds going into France from the Middle East, but there's papers that prove M2 are Natufians first. came from the Natufians. And we got papers, for example, here, according to Christy G. Turner, it's the second, there is archaeological and physical anthropological evidence, anthropological, probably said that weird, evidence for the relationship between modern Semitic speaking populations and of the Levant and the Natufians. So these are clearly E1B1 lines. So not only we can prove that E1B1 is Afro-Asiatic, but we can also prove that it's deeper than Afro-Asiatic, it's Semitic. So we can prove that it's Semitic, that is linked to Semitic. So E1B1 would come from that line, which would be Semitic groups, right? We can even see cranial, basically looking at the head shapes of certain groups, right? They basically analyzed certain groups and they found out that the Natufians and the populations of North or Sub-Saharan Africa, so that M2 you're probably thinking about, the Sub-Saharan Africa, a result carried haplogroup E. So it lets you know that obviously Natufians had haplogroup E, but we know that by looking at those studies, they're not only Semitic, right? They're not only Semitic, but they also have ties to, how you say, basically, Afro-Asiatic, Semitic, and whatnot. So E groups, we already know that has ties to Afro-Asiatic and everything. That's going to be earliest ties. But we also know that this group would have became some of the, how you say, even other groups with different languages. So you can see that that's E1B1C, E-M329, E1B1C, that's E1B1C. So you can see right there. Sometimes E1B1C is spoken of only in its code name or in its ISOGG name, pretty much. And that's what we're seeing there is E1B1C, obviously Afro-Asiatic with its family nodes, as we can see there, right? Some other family, E1B1Bs clearly, and some M2s, no doubt, right? So that's going to be something that we got a good understanding of, that obviously Afro-Asiatic would even go into Africa. So just because it's found in Africa doesn't mean Afro-Asiatic didn't migrate into Africa. You can see a lot of this when you look at the movements of Afro-Asiatic, that it's going to be Middle, Eastern, and Northern African. So that's something that's important to know with that. So how is M2 also connected? Because of the family, right? It could pick up other languages, but it still would have some ties to Semitic, just to kind of make that understood. So, and we can get one more piece of understanding. Among the first farmers, those of the Levant trace 2/3 of their ancestry to people related to the Natufian. So we got people in the Levant as Natufians from the ancient Near East. And that's where they got Semitic from. That's where the cradle of Semitic was as well, right? So the cradle of Semitic, where you get your Akkadians coming out, your Amorites, your other nations that picked up movement, Aramean and whatnot, they would start around that area. So yes, M2 shows itself to be Semitic, just to kind of let that be understood. So you see some things about the said Near Easterners and whatnot. Just looking to see if this goes over, right? So this is a source that, we talk about often, this one right here, and talk about basically its ties to its family ties and whatnot. So this is something I'll just save on the side. You can see where it's talk about those Natufians and everything, the Natufians. And they're basically, obviously, Levantan. So I would say M2 E groups, Afro-Asiatic, cleared ties to Semitic, right? I would say so by sources. Yep, that's right. M2 is a son of a Shemites. I would say so. Definitely by the sources, without a doubt. Can you explain what haplogroup is Ham and Shem and Japheth? Amen. So a lot of people, I'm glad that you asked this, because a lot of people say there is no evidence for a Ham, Shem, and Japheth family. But I just want to show you this real fast so you can see the total picture. Now you got to ask yourself, what was God saying when he was telling us about Ham, Shem, and Japheth? I'm going to do a live later on today and do like a little summary of the whole biblical narrative. So from basically the messages given to Noah and the messages given to Moses, and then how he wanted the Israelites to kind of product themselves, and then why he said that was going to be a new covenant. But notice this chart. Now, This right here is, I would say this is one of our prizes, because we took hours upon hours upon hours doing, this is one of the most rarest maps you can see today. This is one, why do I say this is one of the most rarest? Because this is Paleolithic, Mesolithic, Neolithic, till the Bronze Age. Every fossil confirmed found, almost every, that we have of almost every haplogroup. So this will be like before Abraham. And notice almost every group is before Abraham. So you got obviously CF, DE, and A and B, which would make sense. You know, obviously our FactSat had to have fathers and all that. But notice something about this map. This is what I thought was really interesting about this map. So everything that's 1 starts off like Paleolithic. So you can see for the blue, these will be the D and E groups. So you can see 1's over here, 1's over here, right? No 1's in Africa for the blue, but you do see 1's for the A and B groups in Africa, because we found A and B groups early in Africa. You got some 1's over here, but that's not where human civilization started. The claim of the outer Africa concept, that's not where they started. So that means that this group had to migrate from somewhere else. And that's what happened. This over here, having ties with this one, actually these two, a lot of people miss this one. There's an older line, older than the Natufian and the Iberasians, that are over here in the areas of Europe that we have pointed out before. But that ties this group right here, this D and E group, this E group, ties all these groups together from the Mediterranean Sea. So that ties all those groups together. It later obviously spreads into areas down the Fertile Crescent and some areas over here and here. So it basically increases. But the A and B groups, as you see here, have more Neolithic and deeper areas of Africa earlier, and also some of the CF groups. So you can see CF, where does those start? Mostly, as you see, in Europe. So you saw 1's there, 1 there, 1 here, 1 here, 1 here, 1 here. These are like Paleolithic Europeans. 1 here, right? 1's over here. We found almost every lineage for some reason went to Japan. You know, must have been something that they liked very early on. And then over here, we also found 1's over here for some of those CF lines. So what happened was this. Whatever happened in the early lines of humans, they started off, we have a 0.0. They start off somewhere around here after basically wipeout events. Then they spread across a vast of nations. The CF groups take the upper northern areas all the way to basically crossing over the seas till they settle in the Americas. And they basically establish themselves in America. So when they get over here, then comes the Mesolithic time frame. So 2, you can see right here, they start spreading in Southern Americas right here before anyone else. We also get some Ham sons apparently coming over there. And we also get some of Shem sons that settle in South America. So they really make some sea journeys. And why are they making sea journeys? Because they're seafaring people. Remember, 100 years, supposedly 100 years, Noah's sons were building boats, building the ark. So they're very known to how to deal with boats and stuff. So their descendants are going to be known to boats. As the water starts to go down, the land settle, you're still going to have some cold areas because all that water and everything. That's why that temperature drops after the flood and everything. And you're going to notice that with the Neolithic bottleneck. But D and E mostly settles in the middle area, so around these areas here. A and B groups more settle like around these areas and here. So A and B groups kind of do like a thing like this, and they also settle in these areas, as you think like Nimrod and stuff. And J groups mostly settle in the north. So they mostly do a northern settlement over here before going in anywhere else. So they mostly settle in this area. So that's why when I look at IJ and it's no J, it makes sense that is European, because most of the Europeans settle up in these areas, and that's what J went. That's exactly where J went. J first of all went up here into these upper areas before any of the said Semitic groups and all that. So they're going to settle in the upper areas like their other descendants, their families. So CF necessarily would be the node that creates what are called the said Japhetic lines. DE will be more the Semitic lines, and A and B will be more the Hamitic lines. If you was to go by that said concept of these nodes being separate, right? Because that's one big thing you gotta know, that the biblical narrative also says nodes. A lot of people don't know that. A lot of times when people look at the family trees in the Bible, they don't know that God's telling you about nodes, because he tells you that a Japhanite can't make a Hamite, and a Hamite can't make a Shemite. That's a node. That means there's a clear separation of families there. There's a clear separation. So we would have to link up all these lines to these 3 supernodes. And those 3 supernodes are thus. That's split from CT and BT. Right? And that's something we had talked about when breaking down the whole thing. Now, I won't be able to do like a whole long thing on it, but I'll show you a video that would tell you a decent summary of it, and pretty fast, I think. Let me point it out. That video, right? I'm going to point it out on this. Is either this one, you can see this one, and if you subscribe, that's the video that will be mainly on the page if you go to the home page. Otherwise, there's a shorter one, because that one's a little longer on like a major breakdown of it, but there's a shorter one. I got to think about where that one's at. I'll add it to the description too. I'll add it to the description of what it is, pretty much. Let me make sure just to see, because it's always nice to know what's the possibilities of who is who in the separations. Let me just see on this thing. Yeah, I'll add it to the description, because I'm not really 100% sure which one it is. In fact, I could probably just look on the playlist, because everything that's saved would be saved to this list. All right, so let me go down right here. So, so I just want everyone to know, brothers and sisters, that I'm always available for these type of conversations. And like I said, I don't got no hidden users. No one's hidden right now, right? I try not to hide anyone or try to remove them unless they're doing something extra, unless people do extra. But I don't try to keep them banned for too long. It's like, if that's someone that's doing extra, I might do that for a day or two and give them a chance to talk, because I want everyone to have a chance, even if they feel indifferent, as long as they're respectful, not going crazy and stuff, cussing and all that stuff, then it'd be fine. We can have a conversation on this thing. But anyone that's, maybe because a lot of times everyone gets immature at times. It just happens. A lot of people that get immature. So it's always about giving them a second chance. But let me see where that is. I'll put the one that I think would be the best one. It's like a 40-minute breakdown of the academic information of how these nodes split. Here it is. Well, 30, yeah, less than 40 minutes. This one I'll put in the description, and this one will be the best one, because it would be a conversation that I had with a geneticist on how the splits are. And I don't think that you can't just get this information from a regular scholar. You can't get it from a scholar of Assyrian records. You can't get it from a scholar you can't get it from an Egyptologist. You can't get this stuff from anyone else but a geneticist, right? A geneticist is going to give you more foundation of these things. So a lot of people, if they start making assumptions saying, oh, there's no proof that the Bible's talking about these family trees and all that stuff, that's one of the interesting things that you'll start to find, that if we can also find evidence that the Bible's talk about nations that came from thus people, then maybe the Bible has some understanding that maybe might be above someone's pay grade, right? So it requires someone to get kind of creative and look into these things. So that's what this video is. If you want to see it, I'll put it in the description of how Ham, Shem, and Japheth's nodes are separate. And that will kind of give some clarity to basically what the biblical narrative is displaying to us and what it wants us to know. Because I honestly do believe that when the Most High spoke to Moses about Noah and about Adam and about all those things, he wanted the people of the Bible to have a limited understanding. Now, when I say a limited understanding, he wanted them to know the understanding of creation, but to a extent where they're not like knowing all about every culture, but knowing that they are a people that started off like a genetic bottleneck, and they became basically a large group of people, and they were people that were selected, right? And they were people that survived. That's what the Most High wants people to know when you look at the biblical narrative and he's describing a summary of the creation. Is because the more you look into these ancient cultures, the more crazy they are. So that's one of the biggest things is to know. So that's what this design is, and it's breaking down like the actual nodes. So not an unrooted chart, but the nodes. So the roots of it, roots into roots into roots. Biggest thing. But that's what's important to know, that is BT and CT. So BT and CT is not African. We found them in Eurasia, but we found that BT and CT, which doesn't actually come from A groups, because a lot of people, they will say that A groups make BT and CT. They don't, by actual genetics standards. But rather, BT and CT will be the split that makes all other humans. So that's going to be important to know when thinking about those divisions. All right. I see this. So J is a descendant of F. That's right. That's right. F, in a way, did not start in Arabia. We know this without a doubt. F would be Indo-European. So just to kind of give you some education on that family. F group, I know the F group very well, and it definitely did not start in the areas of Arabia. How do we know? Because we got F groups in his oldest find. So let's take a look at one of them, for example. Let's take a look at what's the oldest Fs that we got. Now, besides some of the mutations that we see by actual papers that tell us, basically some of the Eurasian or some of the European groups of it that are found, and the mutations from CF and everything. I'm just gonna go to a summary video. Here's a nice little summary video.
In this video,
this person does a little summary and whatnot. I'm just gonna jump a little ahead to where he talks about the fossils and whatnot, and where it has started off at. So he says, this is what he says on this thing, just to show you what it's saying. He says F would have started somewhere over here in India, not over here. It says CF groups want to divide it, and then F would have basically started somewhere around India. Now, what's interesting is I'm going to show you that F actually started right here and went to China. And the midpoint would be India. So F will start somewhere around India. That's where F will be around, in the middle, because it's going to connect a major family, a massive, large family, right? So let me just show you this little thing real fast on this thing. Once I find it. All right here. So here is that F group. Here's the oldest one, Belgium, not in the areas of the Levant, unfortunately, is in Paleolithic Belgium, 45,000 years ago, with an M group. So that shows you that it's like in the Asian area. So we don't get them into the Levant until like 10,000 BC, but they're in China. So they're in China before they're in the Levant. So here's China, F-M89. So right there. So that's going to be a real find. And also, let's point out the oldest one right here. So this will be the oldest F find. So it's not in Arabia, blood family. It's right here, just to make that clear, in Belgium. So, or how you see that? Machir, rather Belgium. Basically the areas of Europe. Oh, we are saying Belgium. But that's going to be the real finds of it. That's going to be real finds of it. Otherwise, if you have one that's older than this 45,000 F line, that's European, right? Making all other European groups, even the Asian ones. If you have an older one than this, then you can share it. But this would be the one that would be the starter. Even in fact, let's look at the like ancient finds. You can see right here for the Paleolithic groups. What do we see? F groups, as it says right here, 47 to 43,000 years ago before present. it says they was in Eastern Europe. So F was in Eastern Europe. F is an Eastern Europe group because we know CF makes C and F groups. So C obviously is from Europe. It says all ice-free Europe. And we know that BT and CT, which are the early splits, remember those ones split, those are also in Europe. So those are in European areas, right? And then you get your IJKs that obviously in Western Europe and other things like that with their mtDNA nodes, right? So for the full understanding there, CF groups will be highly Indo-European. That's why IJK, right? IJK groups are important to note for all Western European groups. So whatever comes from IJK would be technically ancient Indo-European from the starts, from the roots, just to get that understood. So BT had two sons, which is B and CT. That's the biggest thing. Let's look at it. Let's look at that. That's why I went to this, right? Because there's a lot of false accusations by Wiki, right? If you know, Wiki has some sources, but Wiki misuses its secondary sources. So remember, encyclopedias are nice for understanding the primary sources, but encyclopedias are secondary sources. So if you got that from an encyclopedia, you got that from a secondary source. And if you got that from a geneticist, you got to prove it by the mutation. Because most geneticists who actually prove it by the SNPs mutations finds out this, right? Just to understand that the claim that, just to make it clear, that BT had two sons, and B and CT had two sons, which is CF and DE. And it says it's impossible for B to come from CT because B came from BT. Now, obviously that's important. CT doesn't make A and B groups. So CT doesn't make A and B groups, right? Let's look at the source, right? So what do we hear from some of the sources when we hear about CT, right? Like you said, CT is important to note. CT makes DE and CF, not B, right? So what does that mean about CT? If it doesn't actually make B, yeah, BT makes B. That means BT and CT has an early division, because we also know from sources that CT, right? The CT node doesn't actually come from BT or from A groups, but they split, they divide. As it talks about the fork and everything and all those things, and they say none of the non-African groups, CT among them, descend from any of the A groups. So that's important to know about those divisions. So we don't need A to be under CT. In fact, A is not under CT. And that's what makes that separation. CT and BT separates A and B, which are Hamites, and D and E, which are Shemites, and CF, which are Japhanites. You see how that works? So it's very, very important to know about that family SNP, right? So A and B can't be Ham. So why can't A and B be Ham? Because B is from BT, and BT had two sons, CT. It sounds like you're kind of confused on the way a node works. Because if let's say for example CT and BT, right? Let's say for example CT and BT, which will be these two nodes right here. This would be BT, and this would be CT. And they'll say that BT makes these lines under here. But there's notice about this family here. There's a division. So there's families over here, which are A groups, as you can see right here. And it'll tell us that C groups, CT groups, didn't come from A groups. But if you look at the assumption of the tree, they'll say that even, for example, here. Let's see, which one is it? On one of these, haplogroup story. Let's actually go to the little assumption on here, right here. Okay, so this thing. Notice that we can see that it says A groups over here making a BT group and CT group. Notice something that's important about this BT and CT group. So BT, CT, that's actually your division. Let's go and take a look at what we see here. So you see this will actually be your BT and to be your CT group. But we actually notice, right? Let's just take a look at what the sources say, right? So they look at the tree and they know that it does not connect the way that a lot of assumptions are with the A groups, right? I'm just going to read it word for word on this part, right? In other words, we see a departure of a first African branch, said A0, from the main tree. What is it saying? Departure. It's saying there's a division. Like at the beginning of man, we know that there's obviously early mutations. That means A groups separate from early man. That means do everyone come from an A group, or did A groups separate from the ancestral node? This is what it says. It says from the main tree, none of the non-African groups, BT among them, descended from that departed haplogroup A0, which is A1b on the graph, right? So that means that groups didn't come from A0, right? What else? We can go a little more deeper into it, to the A1s and stuff, into their SNPs, mutations and whatnot. And this is what they say of them. None of the non-African groups, CT among them, descend from the second African branch, A1A. And they go to the list of all the said African, the outer Africa concept mutations, and they prove that CT is an early division, early divided, separated from A groups. So the claim that BT makes B and CT, you're missing something, because A doesn't even make BT. So now you got to figure out, did BT actually make A as well? So now you got BT as a node making A and B. You know that? That's important, because that's actually what this even shows. It even talks about that the nodes that will come from BT that creates these nodes, as you see your A groups right here, right at the top, they're coming from one node, from this node right here. That means there was an early separation at these nodes. Families are going to come from these two nodes. That's important. That means, what does that mean? What does that actually mean? So you can see right here, A groups don't make these groups. See how those A groups don't make those groups based on actual science? We can see right here, again, of all those A groups, all of them, what does it say? And none of BT or CT lineages descend from them. So this is where, if someone wants to know about the pinpoints, this is where you got to start putting that drop in. You know what I'm saying? That drop, that time, like sitting there and examine these things, because really BT and CT, this is the root. These are the ones that separate, making all lineages. Once you realize that, and ask geneticists about it. I got questions that I asked geneticists. Let's go back over here and show what I'm saying here, right? Because I had talked about monophylactic families before. And you can ask this to a geneticist so you can confirm the division properly, because they'll tell you the truth. They'll tell you the real truth behind these lines. You just got to know how to ask them. Right? For example, let me show you. I'm gonna show you what the geneticists say concerning the splits of these families. So first, let me show you something that's important to know, even like in biology, all this stuff or not, right? Biography or not. You know someone, you get an idea on someone, on their origins, where they came from. Guess what you gotta start looking at? You know, if you want to really know someone, a real person, not by their phenotype, but you gotta know their genetics. So let me show you something real fast, what geneticists say concerning certain nodes and whatnot. The main one is going to be basically your D and E, CF, and all that stuff. But first, let me read these things. Let me first point out something right here. It's important to know what is a monophylactic family. That means every descendant from his node, or from the father. So a person that comes from that father. So if we say like this is Abraham, this will be Isaac, Jacob, and Esau, and all that, whatnot, all that. And whatnot, from obviously Isaac. But this you got to understand from here, this will be a node. So let's say this will be like a node like Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, Keturah, sons, and whatnot. Get a good idea of a monophylactic family. Why? Because a monophylactic family is a clade. And why is that important? Right? It's a common descent, a monophylactic group, sometimes called a clade, right? Or the ancestral, basically what is the ancestral node that makes all nodes proceeding from it, right? That's going to be very important. That's a real definition. And why is that important? Because as soon as you ask about these nodes and these mutations, you'll find out what's the monophylactic family, right? For example, here, yes, then it's correct to say F-M89 is a grandfather of IJK, but not A and B and D and E groups. Why is that? Why is that important to ask it like that? To know the monophylactic split, that all the F groups are one family, all the A and B groups are another family, and all the D and E groups, YAP plus groups, are another family. So that's 3 families. And that's all the humans that we see on the earth today of men. That means if these are Ham, Shem, and Japheth, it makes perfect sense that we would have 3 ultimate supernodes, A and B, D and E, and CF, that makes a spread of a family, multiple families, right? Because remember, Ham, Shem, and Japheth have multiple sons, and their sons have sons, and their sons have sons and sons and sons, right? So that just shows you how massive that family is, right? It's going to increase, but it's going to link to those ultimate nodes. So that's what we see. If we wanted to make it make sense, it can make sense that A and B will be separate by BT, CT splits, making CF and DE groups. Though these are different families. So that means that Noah could have easily had a supernode that combined BT and CT. Noah could have been a BT/CT node, and his sons could have came out with Ham with BT and Shem with CT and Japheth with CT. You hear what I'm saying? The original Ham, Shem, and Japheth could have been BT and CT. And then from our Faxad sons, the mutations when it took place, because that's how genetics work. They degrade, they mutate. That's when the mutations happen later. So Japheth and Shem could have had the same nodes in the beginning. They could have both had CT. And then from Japheth, he could have had a CF develop. And then from Shem, he could have had a DE develop. But they both could have started off with the CT node. This is something I had showed before. On that, just because you get another descendant doesn't mean it's another node or a new mutation. A new mutation doesn't come every generation. Mutations accumulate after a certain time. Sometimes they're random. Sometimes they depend on diet or the person they mix with, all that stuff. But mutations are not next generation, another mutation. Next generation, another mutation. It's not like that, right? That's not true, right? But you would have families who would have the same nodes for a long time. So they can easily have the ancestral nodes for a long time. Ancestral node is just a node that the same father has. So let's say like someone conclude the early groups were BT and CT. All the lines of Ham, Shem, and Japheth could have had BT and CT for a long time until they mutated. That's one of the biggest things because we don't have pinpoint exactly Ham, Shem, and Japheth, but we have nodes of a large family that we can bring them to a summary of their supernode, right? That's what makes it possible to find out the origins of people. So just to kind of make that understood that we can prove these 3 descendants. Like if someone wants to know Ham, Shem, and Japheth, we can prove that. We can prove Ham, Shem, and Japheth. But then we have to prove which one's Noah, right? Someone can say that Ham would be CF and Japheth would be A and B, and Noah or they can mix it up like that. Someone can do that. That's possible to do. But I think when we start putting those genetics to their source culture, it starts to bring things together. That's what I'm saying about the separation of IJK's total family versus DE's family of YAT plus and AB group. So we can make a big difference of these groups. Now, is it that these groups were on a actual like arc and all those things? It's possible, but most likely in the concept of it, you got to look at the exaggerated years and examine that carefully. We did that before. We can do that again. But necessarily, if we had to put them all in the arc, that's the only way they would fill in the arc, by those 3 supernodes like that. So that's the best way to get a good understanding of the biblical narrative when you're looking at it genetically, is that, yes, we can have these supernodes that don't make each other, but do make every single person today. Every single human today comes from these 3 supernodes. So that's what's really important to know about that. Right? But keep it going, because that's great that you're saying that, to get a good understanding of these things. We did not come from A or A0, but we came from A01. That. Nope, that's not true. because you can, in fact, we know that's not true, because there is a individual called Eurasian Adam or Adam, and that line actually links to A00, deeper into A00 and deeper than that. So A with 3, in fact, it's on this right here. You can see the 4 zeros right here, 4 zeros for Denisovan. So 4 zeros from Denisovan, 3 zeros for Neanderthal, and this will actually be A with 2 zeros or your Asian Adam. And then it tries to throw in these A groups, but these don't actually tie by mutation nodes. So that's what we were just going over, is that what you're more thinking about is A00, which actually is a different family and is 0% of the tree, because family tree tells you that A00 is 0% of the tree. That's important to know. We go over that quite a few times when we point out A00 is literally 0% of the tree. It does not make M2. So that's why they link it to Eurasian Adam, but it doesn't link that way like some people may think it links like that. So it doesn't actually connect to those A0 or A0Ts, A1, A1Bs. And that's what we were just talking about for a lot of these nodes, for CT and BT, especially CT. CT doesn't come from the A groups. That's one of the biggest things. So that mutation rate like that that's what we were just talking about. That's not how it mutates. It actually, see that BT at the end there, that BT and CT, that BT actually makes those A groups. So that's important to know. And CT doesn't come from any of those A groups. So that's something that's important to know. But it's always good when you're sharing family, because we can talk about these things and really get deep into the depth of them. That's one of the biggest things that I want to allow brothers to have this chance to go over, right? A itself has many mutations way before BT exists. Now, do you have a culture of A? Let me show you something. Let me show you something how I know you don't got a culture, how you're just saying stuff. I'll prove to you that you don't know what you're talking about. I'm gonna show you that you have no idea what you're talking about. All right, so watch this. Let me just show you something. All right, so the earlier lines before all those groups, because just like you said there, you said basically A existed in all those areas and whatnot, and basically all these basically would be there. And it says, so Shell and Hem, or basically Shem, I'm sure he's saying there. So Shem and Hem and Japheth don't exist. Smiley face. And that's something. All right. So I'm gonna show you that you don't know what you're talking about. So where do humans actually start off at? They don't start off in Africa. You know where they actually start off at? In Eurasia. See those A groups you was talking about? A0, A, and those other A, the alpha, and A00. Look what it says right here in this little study right here that we was talking about before. What should it say here? What I should say. So the analysts identified a Eurasian ydna, so Eurasian ydna A00, that was followed by 3 separate Homo sapien exoduses of A0, A, alpha A from Eurasia into Africa, with A0 signifying the earliest and A the most recent of these early exoduses. So this is kind of interesting, because why is this kind of interesting? Because if you notice, it's saying from these, remember we just talked about this family tree right here, this node. We just talked about this tree, this tree that you're looking at right here, that you see right here. Notice that someone else is using this same tree, because this right here that I just said is undebunkable, that the mutation rate and the understanding of where these lines start by its actual ancient finds will blow your mind. It will absolutely blow your mind, because you will think that, they would have to be in Africa and everything. But notice this, that 250 said on the African scale, 250,000 years ago, they already found that the results were consistent with potential, basically, for translocations of modern humans from Eurasia into Africa. The earliest taking place 250,000 years before present, family. So that's destroying the outer Africa scale. That's literally what that's doing, is that the concept that you have of the outer Africa scale, doesn't stand to recent studies, 2021. And that's just one source out of many on this page of F-M89 and other groups. But notice that it's going to lend no support. As it says right here, the results were accordance with basically the out of Eurasia hypothesis at the same time as they have lent no support to the out of Africa hypothesis. So the concept, what you're trying to use, you're leaning on the out of Africa concept, and you're going to get debunked. I'm gonna tell you that right now. By actual fossil finds, actual fossils, actual movements, you'll get debunked. Because I guarantee you we can confirm all those humans were in Eurasia and separated from other humans. That's what we can actually confirm. It goes deeper, but I'm gonna let you see. You can see it right here. Right, this is right from this. 2021, we got some from 2022, and some stuff is gonna drop later from 2023, and we're gonna go over that. But this is what they were talking about, that the earliest line, the earliest ones came from Eurasia, the earliest ones, right? So that's something that's important to know of modern humans, right? We can go into that. I'm gonna point out one more on this thing, right? I'm gonna point out one more on this thing. All right. So, when you think about like the nodes that split after the flood and everything, you think about modern humans. What were the ones that were wiped out? The Denisovans and Neanderthals were the ones that were wiped out. But all modern humans all exist today, and they come from basically a super node after the Neolithic bottleneck. So they're just groups that basically separate and go into different areas and whatnot. But let me read one more of these things real fast. Right here. Let's read this one. Right. And don't mind these massive years because they're just here just for the sake of understanding some of these things. All right. So we see right here, we estimate that the time of the most recent common ancestor of Neanderthal and modern human Y chromosome, because they say modern human and Neanderthal mixed, actually a long time ago, said 50,000 years ago or 588,000 years ago, right? To between 400,000 to 800,000 years ago, pretty much on their concept. And they say basically what they're looking at is indeed A00. So that's kind of interesting when you realize that the earliest line of humans were mixing with Eurasians and they were in Eurasia. So that's something that's important to know. And if someone wants to say Neanderthals were in Africa, I know. We all know Neanderthals had ties to Africa, but not only Africa. They was in Eurasia and Africa. They didn't start off in Africa. They went into Africa at their last stages. So that's important. So we do know about that as well. As you can see right here, Neanderthals had a lot of this era in parts of Africa and whatnot, but they had a lot of parts of Eurasia. But the areas where we found A00 mixing, or some of the modern humans with a mix of ancient Arctic humans, was in Eurasia. So that's kind of interesting to think about and note. So I'll just leave that like that. El Sharon, right? We have estimated that even the Neanderthal mixture that was at El Sharon, that was in Spain, is about that same time for 100,000 years ago. But it was mixing and moving, as it says right here, of El Sharon. Obviously, it had modern human groups there, as it says here. It placed the Neanderthal lineage as an outgroup to modern humans, including basically what I just deleted there, including A00. So that's just what that is telling you that you might not be running with something if you're running with the Outer Africa concept, because more data came out and the Outer Africa streak will be broken by the data. So recent studies will show us the clarity of those recent studies. So that's why I was breaking down this mixture, right? That this start of A0 is debunked, that we didn't actually start with A groups. And there wasn't only A groups in the beginning. That means there weren't only A groups. So no, the Outer Africa concept where there were only A groups and we all came from A groups did not exist. That was not a real scientific concept. So that's important to note. But early groups existed almost at the same-ish time. So just to make that clear. So if there is a concept of all humans being basically able to create all humans today, so all humans today would come from 3 supernodes, right? That would be A and B, D and E, and CF groups. So you see this little thing right here, this little thing. I'm gonna show you real fast. In fact, I'll leave that here because I'll put this in the description. As I'm usually when I get to this about part in the live, I think it's about an hour in. Usually that's when we solve the problem. An hour or 2 in, that's when we about solved it. I'll stay until like the 2-hour mark just to see if he has any sources. So far he hasn't had any sources, but that's all right because this happens all the time. And anyone who's been here knows this happens all the time. But we'll still keep on having these conversations and proving that the real academic information or the biblical information, all of it ties together quite harmoniously and pinpointly. So pinpoint that errors are easily identified. So let me go to this thing real fast, back to this little thing that we just talked about. And if you want to know what paper this paper is called the Out of Africa Concept, Not Having Enough Proof. That's why they start finding out about this. These studies are not just some random person. These are geneticists. These are people who are studying these things and they're looking into the actual information, because a lot of people don't know the Out of Africa concept was not built on fossils, especially during the time when they had the Piltdown Man stuff going on. Yeah. So especially when they had the Piltdown Man stuff going on. Yeah. You go, sir. So very important to know. Let me go to something on here real fast before I leave. So there's that thing again, right? That's what we were just showing. Because again, there's a difference between a rooted chart and an unrooted chart and a circular chart. These are major differences. And it'll look very sad when someone's trying to root from an unrooted and someone's trying to show like it's all types of things. Like I'm not gonna get into. But this was important about this paper. Let me just whip it up and show you why this thing is important. It's the most important foundational paper in genetics right now today. And it's verified by multiple geneticists. Multiple. But it opened the eyes of genetics, because what it actually shows is the way that these families are actually tied. That the way these families are tied are important to note. So here's an interesting picture right here. Remember how I was saying A and B began together? Let me see if I can open this on a new tab or something. Yeah. All right. So this little image right here, which I don't know why I don't have a zoom thing in, but this pretty much is an interesting image because I'll open it up on this so I can get a more zoom in on it. All right, so let me open it up so that we can get a good understanding of this PDF before, we did do a little closing and everything. As you know, I don't usually be up at this time because I got 2 little ones, and besides taking care of them, right, with their, the things going on there, but I like to go into these things because they're not just interesting, but they're eye-opening. I think these things are eye-opening. But let me go to something on here that I think is important on this thing. It's just a picture right here. All right, so you see this little picture right here? Notice it has a root. So right here is your root right there. So that's your root. And then notice it goes out. What's important to know about these charts when you see these corners like this, that's just a straight shot. So from the root, notice from the root, it goes straight to CT. There's no mutations. There's no mutations there's no BT, there's no A group, that makes the straight shot to CT groups, right? Because this same chart, the same design where you see it like this, and you got this split right here, this node that makes your A groups and your B groups. Notice that your A and your B groups are connected by these nodes. So your A and B groups are connected by a root, but they're not under CT. Nor do they make CT, nor do they make CT. But there's a root. There's a root that goes straight to CT, right? So that this is actually telling us that CT families have to be separate from A and B groups, not coming from A and B groups. DE doesn't make A groups, like how I don't know why Jensen made D and E making A groups, which makes zero sense. So we know D and E doesn't make A groups, and we know that A groups don't make CT groups. So that's two walls that we have to take in consideration. That one, F groups don't make DE groups, A groups don't make DE groups, and A groups don't make CT groups. So we have to separate that DE group and make them an independent family and search them independently, the YAP groups. Study them independently. That means Yomon people, the Japanese, right? What I mean by Yomon, right? The Yomon culture right here. So studying the ancient Japanese D culture of Jomon people fairly, and study how this Neolithic culture developed, and then the Natufian groups. So D groups, Yomon groups in Japan, Neolithic, ancient, and Middle Eastern Natufians. No wonder that actually this study, you know what this study actually says on this thing? I'm gonna leave it like this. What it says right here on this little study that I think is kind of interesting, because you wouldn't think that a geneticist would say something like this, but check what it says here. It says the Middle Eastern D and E groups split. So that's important. In the Middle East, D and E splits. So that's why you got ancient Yomon in Japan, because they had to split upper in the Eurasian area to go to Japan, right? It makes sense. But I wanted to show that real fast, as I think it's important, right? I'm gonna leave it like that. Let's see, we got 10 more minutes. I'll let the brother talk about it. Split, not descend, right? That's right. In a way, split, not descend, but split is still considering that you come from that same node. So it's gonna be a node, one node, right? Go back to that drawing real fast. So one node that's gonna make multiple families. So one node that's gonna make multiple families. So if P2, if I can prove, this is what I'm saying. I want you to understand this so that you're not thinking that I'm trying to pull one on you. If I can prove to you that P2 alone is Eurasian, I can prove to you that its sons came from Eurasia. And if I can prove to you that someone in this family is Afroasiatic and Semitic, I can prove to you family ties of Afroasiatic and Semitic. So by connecting these families all together, especially the E1B1B groups with these as well, because we know that these ones are also Eurasian, they have an African and Eurasian tie. Now, that's what the biggest thing is. Notice, I do not deny that E groups, even though D groups by ancient finds have no ancient African finds of D that I actually found by confirmation and double checking. But E does go into Africa, right? There's to point that out. E goes into Africa, but E goes into Africa. That's important. It doesn't start in Africa and remain only in Africa and solely in Africa. But E does go into Africa, but after it was in Eurasia. So you can see in Eurasia and some areas of Eurasia, and then goes into Africa. So E does go into Africa. E groups do go into Africa, but they go into Africa and they replace the earliest African lineages, which were the A and B groups. So A and B were earlier in Africa. When E goes into Africa, they fight with them. And how do we know that too? I'm going to open up one more source real fast. We had the Natufian went down into Africa and started fighting with a culture in Africa. It starts settling in the areas of the Fertile Crescent, lower Fertile Crescent, Nile River. They start taking that from basically groups that were earlier in Africa. So I want to show you this because we went over it before real fast, but I probably didn't stress what the Natufian did after they left the Levant. And not all of them left the Levant, but some of them did. But I'm going to show you something real fast that I think is kind of important to note the wars that were happening around it. An early war, the earliest evidence, some of the earliest evidence of war happened were involving the Natufians and them moving into the south. So they didn't have an easy, it wasn't just like an easy migration when they moved into the south. They had some confrontations. And this tells us that there was someone in the south already settled. A and B groups, the Neolithic groups. And that's why when you think about Egypt, there's Upper and Lower Egypt, because they were constantly fighting, because Egypt was not uniform. Egypt was not a uniform land until like later on, but it's always been in battle. There was always Upper and Lower Egypt until those two hats became one, Upper and Lower Egypt, if you know what I'm talking about. Upper and Lower Egypt was divided, right? But let me show you something real fast that I think is kind of interesting to note on this. All right. So here on this thing, what we're talking about is some of the early agriculturalists that settled in the Nile Valley. Who were they? In 10,000 BC, migrants from the Red Sea. So from the Red Sea, they migrated into the Nile Valley, right? And they would settle in the lower areas from the Red Sea. But who was making their movements into that area? We can look at basically some of the evidence of early warfare, right? Just gonna point out two of these little things right here. So first, you can see from a secondary source, you can see it'll talk about early warfare, and it talks about some of the earliest warfare that had happened in the lands. And one of the most earliest ones, to make sure, point this out real fast. Right there, you can see, right there, you can see this little area right here. All right. My bad. All right, so let's wrap this up. Let's bring it home. You know what I'm saying? Let's make it happen. Let's bring it home and make it happen, right? That's right. That's right. Any comments? Like the brother said, try to make them clear. If you have something to say, make those comments clear, and we'll touch on those things. Because few people know you might change something. Listen to me when I'm saying this. If you can convince me, I'm on bias. I keep telling people this. I'm on bias. If you can convince me, I guarantee you'll convince me by the sources. I guarantee it. If you got solid sources, you'll convince me. The only thing is you got to remember, I got sources too from geneticists, and I'm convinced from sources. Now, let's first talk about these sources. Now, remember how I was talking about real fast what happened with the Natufian? So let's remember this, because I want to give you this understanding of how the Natufian went into Africa. So 10,000 BC, migrants from the Red Sea hills are going to go into basically the Nile Valley. So what happened was the earliest battles happened when the groups of the Natufian, right? And you can look up Natufian homeland, and Natufian are clear Levantan groups. They had to cross from the Nile to go down. And when they went down, they met with those A and B groups. And a lot of people don't notice, because even if you look at E1, B1A, M2, it tells you that they replaced African groups. Look what it says right here. Let's go to M2. ydna. Let's go to M2 ydna and notice with the swiftness, right? You'll notice what it says about the E groups. It says right here from P2. So like P2, who are P2? Natufians, E1, B1, right? 10,000 years ago, Natufians. That's important. But notice right here what it says about the E1, B1 groups. It says that they moved into Africa. As it says, they're now dominant. Today they're now dominant. They dominated the earliest inhabitants. However, we know what about the earliest inhabitants? We know that they have A and B groups, pretty much. So what happened, let's go back over here. What happened was this line that was totally different than the African cultures started to make a movement into Africa. And guess what happened? They end up attacking the ones in Africa and going to war with them. So the earliest war graves found within 27 slain people dated back to 10,000 years ago. So they got their graves pretty much, and they know that they were fighting. They know that these groups were basically going at it. Here's a study from Nature, the exact study. So intergroup violence along early, basically Paleocene hunter-gatherers and basically the areas of Kenya. So the group going down from the areas of, how you say, the Red Sea, going down into the areas of Africa, and they started to fight with groups that were down there. So it was pretty bad, I would say. I would say that the battle was not fair, and it was horrible, I guess. But obviously there was two different cultures there. There was no mercy. They didn't care if it was women or children. They came down there and slaughtered and settled themselves down there. Now, there was like I said, this has to be understood in concept, that the Natufians, just like how we see from other places, as it says right here, the most ancient archaeological record of what could have been a prehistoric massacre, is at the site, this one that we would just kind of talk about in the Nile Valley, the groups going down to the Nile and everything. I'll just show you what the place looks like right here. So it's basically a part that's in the upper area of basically where Egypt basically is. And it basically was a line that was going down there and started to fight with the original Egyptian groups and started to settle in those areas, right? And you can see they'll say that obviously they would have ties with groups that would probably be groups of Iberusians, so the Natufian type groups, as it says, Natufians. So Iberusian, Natufian style groups were there, but also they found pygmy fossils. So pygmies are those A and B groups. So remember how we've seen that, as it says right here, from the Mambuti and the Koshin, right? Mambuti, Koshin, that's actually, Mambuti, Koshin, all that. Those are actually basically deep African groups, like ancient groups, ancient groups, Mambuti and all that stuff on that, Koshin. and pygmies. So that's actually in a way pygmy right there. Okay, so let's get back to that real fast so we can talk about this because it's pretty crazy, but it is a real event that happened. It's a real thing that happened, but this is for real. So they went down, they found arrows, they found spears, they found 61 individuals that they found there, and 38 of the skeletons show sign of trauma. So they was going berserk, like they were fighting. They were really fighting down there. And that's why when I say the Natufian who were settled in the Levant, and then the A and B groups that were like the Pygmy, other groups like that were settled in Lower Africa, they fought very early. And this is something that isn't usually taken into consideration. But they were not on sides. They were not the same culture, and they were fighting intensively. And there was a lot of fights in that time, but this was like one of the earliest ones, I would say, would be one of the earliest battles that they had in that time. So it would have been in this little a tie with this culture here. So from Sudan, that's how they got down into that area. They migrated and went to war, start fighting with different groups. So that's what we were talking about before when we was talking about this group having a back migration from the areas of Africa. So this one talks about it pretty much. Let's go to the first page. All right, so you see a back migration from Asia to sub-Saharan Africa is supposed by basically, obviously, the high resolution of those chromosomes. Right? We had talked about that real fast. I'm just gonna close that for now because I just want to let you know that's how we know the Natufian that were in these areas, not in these areas, by the time of a little bit later, like Heliocene, all that. They end up fighting, and this would be considered after the Neolithic bottleneck. They end up fighting and killing each other, and there was a major difference of culture, major difference that the Natufian groups that were from Eurasia migrated to Africa and dominated that area of Africa, started replacing a lot of lions down there, but they were first Eurasian, right? So that's going to be very important to note. When we think about it, we know because we got ancient finds of them, 10,000, 9,000, right? In the areas of basically where the Dead Sea is and whatnot. And those were definitely being Natufians, as we see right here, right? The point appears in the Natufian Epipaleolithic area in the Sinai. So that's what this is, right? Obviously, Natufians have connections to Syria. So Natufians are actually Mesopotamian, right? As it says, Syrian, Middle Euphrates, and whatnot. So we got some obviously ties of the Natufian all throughout these areas. First, they was in areas where you can see upper areas here. So they had all the green is where you can see Natufian ties. So they would have had ties over here, and they would have also went and had ties over here before even here and here, and not here yet, not yet. But they did have some ties over there across the seas, across the Mediterranean and Spain. But they did not yet go into West Africa or East Africa. They're not going to East Africa because they were being forced down. The Natufian were also fighting with some early basal Eurasians. Those are like some of the IJK sons, like even R and things like that. That some of the nations of the north push some of the Natufian groups down, but some of the Natufians end up going into the north too. So that's important too. So you can see right here, Natufian, some of them stayed in this area and some of them went up here. But here's the Iberasians. They shipped across the coast, and it was the said Iberusians that most likely fought with the ones of Egypt. It was the Iberusian ones that most likely fought with the ones of Egypt. So just to get a little, well, probably zoomed in as much as I could there. So that's important to know. So there was a group that was up here in the north, the Natufians kind of being in the middle right there, and then there was a group at the bottom down here, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. So Ham would have been at the bottom, Shem would have been in the middle, Japheth would have been on the top. And then as groups moved, they relocated. That has to be taken into consideration, locational movements, migrations, and why was that migration happening and whatnot. So that's something that's important to know as well. But we do know that even in the African culture, they moved Semitic. Semitic moved with the Natufians. So that's what's really interesting. That the Semitic language started to move into the areas of Africa. Just to kind of make that simple there. That's just something that I think is important. So this is something that usually not a lot of people look into, but the earliest war evidence tells us about how those Levantan groups moved into areas of Africa and basically became its own culture. But that's why we see that indeed there was definitely evidence of warfare taken off by these cultures. And I think it's important. I think it's interesting and important. It brings it all together, I think. But it's a 2-hour mark. So if you got any sources, now is the time to throw it out. If you didn't believe these things, definitely throw it out. Amen, family. Amen, amen. I hope that these, as always, when I come live, my goal is always to change someone's mind or edify on information, provide maybe some scholarly sources, or maybe give some intake from a secondary question from geneticists on some things on these topics, right? Because I do believe that the biblical narrative is real. I think that we as individuals are people from the biblical narrative. And I think that there's evidence of all those things. So that's one of the biggest things. But when it comes to looking at which exact haplogroup would be more Ham, Shem, or Japheth, I got to honestly be truthful to this. Now, I did not see J being Jews. I did not even find J's being Jews in ancient. Like, if someone gets a J group, what's interesting is if you have a J group that's Bronze Age, Iron Age, and you think they're Israelites, would you be able to share that source culture? Because from my finds, the Israelites look like Nubians, and J doesn't look like Nubians. J looks like people who are indo-European. But there were some J groups that looked like Nubians, but they were Sidonese. They were from Sidon. They were from the Sea People. And the Sea People had some mixture, all that. They had indo-European groups. They spoke indo-European, but some of them were dark. We know because we got a paper of the Sidonese, and it does say that they had SLC 45A2, a pigmentation that's in African Americans, and some of them were darker. They probably had a mix with some of the Levantan groups there in that time. Because Levant apparently in that time had a little darker skin at that time before the Turks start taking over. A lot of people don't think about that. The Turkish invasion, Turkification of the Levant, Turkification of the Levant. It's a real thing. Massive change of the Levant, Turkification of the Levant, or in Middle East. It's highly overlooked how the Ottomans reshaped that whole area and how the British reshaped the whole area and all those things. This is majorly different than ancient times. But J by his roots, IJ by his roots, when I look at I and J, there's no way of making that line original Semitic groups, even Afro-Asiatic, like at that. Because if they was Hebrew, they would also be Afro-Asiatic, technically, right? If they linked to Hebrew, they should have been some ties of Afro-Asiatic. But J only picks it up during times of lingua francas. So they're picking it up from groups that already had it. So they go into the Levant, only Bronze Age, after Neolithic, all that. And they're basically picking up that style, right? They're not going to be the origin of that group. Their original, when you trace them back to their origin, they're Indo-European and Indo-Iranian. And that would give us clues to how they became Turks and other groups like that. That just makes perfect sense, especially in the Indus Valley civilization in lower Southern Europe. It makes perfect sense. All of it balances out. So I would say that this, to me, this family right here is clearly Japheth. Like if you was to say that, like even just look at this. Watch when I do this, and I guarantee if anyone understands this stuff, they would agree with this. If we say that Ham, Shem, or Japheth had a son, and only one of his sons had an IJK node. Can I find any sons of Japheth on IJK nodes? Does anyone believe R is Japheth? Do they believe that T is Japheth? Do they believe J is Japheth? Do they believe any one of those lines, did they believe any one of those lines, R, T, J, or I? If they believe any one of those are Japheth, guess what? This family is Japheth. That's what that means. Why does that mean that? Because the node. You can't say that Noah was right here making an HIJK and made a separation, because it won't even make D and E groups. So remember that. If you want to find a Noah node, it has to also be a group that makes all groups, because every single person today is said from Ham, Shem, and Japheth from Noah. So that means it has to be an ultimate node, like a CT, BT, that makes all nodes. But IJK is underneath F, underneath GHIJK, underneath HIJK. IJK ties IJ and K groups. So this whole family right here will be Japheth. So if we conclude that this is Japheth, that means this is Japheth and this is Japheth's sons. That's what's important about that. So I would say that I have no doubt, based on sources, that K groups and I groups make, without a doubt, Indo-European lines, and J groups are found them too. So I would say that IJK node monophylactically is of Japheth. Like there's no confusion if this is an Indo-European group, right? Even just to end it like this, I'll just show the IJK or ydna. So you can see just from sources. Let's go to. You can see how the node is. See IJK. It connects K groups. So all your K groups, like your all of them, right? R's and P's and whatnot, and also your LTs come from IJK, and your IJ groups come from IJ. So IJ from Northern Europe. So I is clearly Northern Europe. Southern Europe also I, and your J groups from Caucasus. Remember, we talk about that, the Hurrians and whatnot, and all the other groups that they go into the Near East as the Hurrians go down and the Caucasus invasions. So I would say IJK, without a doubt, is Indo-European, because look at how much is in Europe, Caucasus, Asia, right? Also Europe, which is important to know of that. This one says Horn of Africa, Eurasia. I think the T and L groups got to be looked into a little more clear for Wiki. You can see UST Isham, which would be into areas of Eurasia, and also other European groups that would come from this line. So to me, it's clear. Like IJK has to make sons of Japheth if we're taking that concept of monophylactic families. That means that from IJK comes IJ, also comes K. These will be of Japheth, I would say, technically. And as you can see here, here's a source on a place where they're found. Early said Ice Age Europe. They're early Europeans that colonized the areas of Europe. And that's kind of like, no matter how you want to paint it, they're going to be one node from a time where the Europeans were one. And that's just a truth. But some end up going into areas of the Levant, and that's a little later, right? But we got to trace their original root node. And that's what I see from the genetics, that an honest person would tell you that these lines had to be European. Like, it's no doubt. It will be no doubt. So they had to come from Europeans, IJK, and then make their way into the Phoenician area and become Sidonese and Canaanites before any of the Israelites come out of Egypt. Because remember, Israelites will be in Egypt, especially during the time of the Phoenicians and all that stuff. So with that, I would say that in a total picture of it all, I think there is a little more to be explained than just saying J are Jews. I never found a J as a Jew. I never found an ancient J Jew. Only J that are Jews today are the proselytes today. So that's important. That means that is more conversion. then it would be ancient bloodline. Like there's no like Bronze Age Jewish finds. Like there's no Iron Age Jew that I found, right? None. But the Seljuk Turks would fit. Yes, I would say so. So I'll end it on, let's see where we at. I'll end it at the 2 hour and 20 minute mark. So 5 more minutes. I'll do a summary of what we just did. So what we just did today is that I want every brother and sister to know that I'm willing to look at any information, if it's deep information or stuff that maybe they have an opinion on or something like that. I also would like to have direct individuals who may believe that they have tie to Israelites, or who may know someone who has tie to Israelites, and look at their snips personally. I got one that I set aside for basically some of the E1B1A7 lines, and those ones I believe to be Israelites, E1B1A7. E1B1A8 I believe to be some of the Israelites as well. So E1B1A8 and E1B1A7, these are lines that pop up after the Bronze Age, Iron Age, and they go into areas of Africa. But they're also from, like I said, from the Levanten area, from basically the Fertile Crescent. But those are the lines that I find more fit for that compression, in all honesty, like unbiasedly, right? If you know me, I'm unbiased. But real sources, this is what they start to show. Like they're not Neolithic groups. They're Iron Age groups. So find them in the Bronze Age might be interesting. So I want to look at some more Bronze Age of them around the areas of Egypt, because that's where they should be. Israelites, do you know where Israelites should be? In after 6,000 or after 1,600 BC, after 1,600 BC, Israelites should not be in the Levant. They should be in Africa. They should be over here in Egypt. If you start finding them over here, guess what you're probably looking at? Not Israelite culture in Bronze Age. So that's one of the biggest things that I always try to elaborate, is that there were almost no Israelites in the Bronze Age in the Levant. They were all in Africa. That's where they developed. They developed in Africa ever since Joseph was sold to the Egyptians. All the Israelites developed in Africa. So that means they would start spreading throughout those areas, right? So that's an important thing to know. Like that's a fact, right? But we also will find them like, little corners over here, which we do when we bring out sources and talk about them. But that's one of the biggest things that we need to get straight, is that not only would you have Israelites, you have to look at the Jotanites that go into Punt, that we have sources for. The Jotanites go into areas of Punt. So that's why this area and this area is actually important in the biblical narrative. For Jotanites in the area from going from Arabia to Punt, and for Abraham's son. So you got to take account for Peleg and other Eber sons. So that's something that I think is important to know, I think. All right, still got some time. Amen. So again, taking this time, if anyone got any sources, or anything like that, definitely share them, right? That means like if you think maybe a different line is Israelites or something like that, and you got a source to provide for that. Not just, a lot of Jews today are such and such lines. Well, how do we know they weren't replaced? In fact, a lot of Jews nowadays are after the 1st century, when they changed the law. A lot of people don't know this, but I'm going to say it. They changed the law in the Talmud, and they wrote that the line to be a Jew is mitochondria. So to become a Jew is based on mitochondria line, female line. It changed in the 1st century. 1st century BC, it changed from between the 1st century BC and 1st century AD. They wrote that law and changed everything. That's why you hear the law of return by the woman, and they'll be so mixed that just to say that one of those haplogroups today would be just preposterous. So it's like we got to look at it and consider that they are now a totally different people. They have different laws and they have a different structure. So we can't take them as the standard of a Jew. We can't take anyone today as a standard of a Jew. When I say today, like the groups today, we can't take them as a standard of a Jew? Because the mixing. We have to look at ancient Jews to find out what happened. Did they pick up some genetic add-ons? Did they lose some of their lines? So that's what we're working with now. If you already seen, we brought out some information on who are those genetic Jews by academic information. What did they have mixed in them? North African, Egyptian, and Nubian groups. So that's going to be the most important key, is to find groups that are in North Africa and Egypt and Nubia, to find out those ties, because that was what was in Lachish, the Jews of Lachish. So I'll leave it like this. I would say, based on the evidence of Lower Africa and some of the movements of these groups, I would say that the Semitic E groups would be high ties to Israelites. I did a big study on the Natufians, and I think that it makes sense. I think the E groups would be Israelites. And I think pinpointly the mutation of E1B1A1 sons, mainly E1B1A7 and E1B1A8, that would be more of the Israelite lines that got pushed into Africa and went throughout different captivities. I think that would be more of the Israelite lines. And I think that they mix with a lot of those L females. I think that they mix with L females, but I think some mess, as we see, they did mix with some of the people of the nation. But I think a lot of them would mix with a lot of the lines that were in lower Egypt. So that's what I see, based on the fact that the 12 sons of Israel multiplied in Egypt for hundreds of years. Africa, I would say, the African plate would be where I would think to find the Israelites. But they have to have a Eurasian back migration. That's the biggest thing about E. It can't just be, even though A and B groups are also in Africa, they're old. They're super old. And if E showed itself like that, I would say, nope, E can't be, because it is in a culture in Africa, super old and is diverse. But it's not. The only time you find in Africa is after the Bronze Age. It's not Paleolithic or Mesolithic, like I just showed with J being in Europe at that time. And E is not even Paleolithic or Mesolithic in Europe, right? It just starts around these middle areas, these middle culture areas, and then it goes down into the areas of Africa and diverse into these different lines. But it does have ties, especially by D and E's early split, into Eurasia. So Yoman, clearly Eurasian, from a Middle Eastern split of D and E groups, Natufian, all the way to Iberasians or Iberusians, how you say that? They would have settled from the Mesopotamian area all the way to the Mediterranean. So Mesopotamian to Mediterranean coast, locked down by E, all the way through the Red Sea. That was a warmongering people at first, and still were, as we see the Israelites in the way, they had some warmongering, as the nations were warmongering. So we can't just say, well, why were they warmongering? But that's just how it was. They were fighting. But D and E split from the Middle East. These settled over here most of the time. You probably would get some rare ones nowadays going over here. But E would have split around these areas going over here, and then filling up some of these areas before going into modern times, into deep areas of Africa. So I would say, looking at its ancient finds, D and E shows itself to be a Semitic and possible group of being Israelite. I would say, without a doubt, E1B1 star groups, without a doubt, have connections to Syrians, Arabians, and Israelites. So again, E1B1 star groups have ties to Syrians, ancient Arabians, and ancient Israelites. That's what I would say from the E1B1 groups that come from P2. But other than that, family, that's all I got. Let's see what time it is. All right, we're in a little bit in. Now, I want you to know that I just provided this for the sake of the truth, and I'll always be available to have these conversations. So expect these conversations to come if we do have this type of conversation. But I hope next time I can get the person up here and display those things. Well, so with that, family, be blessed, be beloved, and amen, family.